Morning everyone. In this video we'll talk through some of the key quotations for Mr Edward Hyde from Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. There's a GCSE style question at the end of this video for you to try out as well. I'll put a link below to the slides as well as to videos on the key quotes of some of the other characters in the novel. Now let's assume that you're going to be asked a question something along the lines of this in the blue box. Explore how Stevenson presents the character of Mr Hyde in the strange case of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde. Now there are loads of different ways that this question could be answered. You could say that Mr Hyde is presented as frightening, as an outsider, as determined, as mad, as an instrument, or 100 other adjectives. In this video, we'll look at 5 ways that this question could be answered and some of the key quotations for each one. Now I've listed the main chapters for Mr Hyde here. He's mentioned by other characters in other chapters. But the majority of the quotes about Mr Hyde appear in these 6 chapters. It's worth noting that most of the story is told from Utterson's perspective. Chapter 9 is told from Lanyon's point of view, and Chapter 10 gives Jekyll his time to shine as the narrator. Even Enfield gets a shot at narrating the story of the door in Chapter 1, but Hyde, as integral to the story as he is, he never gets to tell his side of the story. It might be worth spending some time thinking about why Stevenson chose to make it this way. What advantages could this have? What does it add to the story? And what does it add to his character? So first, let's look at quotations that show Mr Hyde is presented as animalistic. And what I mean by this is that there are quite a few instances where Hyde is made out to be more of an animal than a human. It would be a good idea to research and write about Darwin's theory of evolution or the now debunked theory of physiognomy for a context link here. The first one is from Chapter 2, and we read that Hyde is described as shrinking back with a hissing intake of breath. The use of zoomorphism makes Hyde out to be like a scared animal who is being threatened. He shrinks back away from the perceived threat and hisses almost like a snake. This one reminds me of the typical reaction of Dracula when he sees a crucifix in the old vampire movies. In the same chapter, we see Hyde snarling like some kind of beast, and then he moves with an extraordinary quickness, almost like an animal that feels it's in danger. Note that although he's described as savage, he's the one who runs away from Utterson. We can infer from that maybe he feels a bit threatened in this quote. Now after Hyde has run away, Utterson is reflecting on the exchange that he had with Hyde, and he notes that the man seems hardly human. If he isn't human, then he must be some form of animal, or maybe some kind of human-animal hybrid. Utterson goes on to call him troglodytic, which is sort of like a caveman. The troglodytes were a prehistoric race of people who lived in caves or holes. So Utterson seems to be inferring that Hyde is a bit more like an animal than a human. Definitely less sophisticated than the cultured gentleman that Utterson is friends with anyway. And this is backed up by Enfield's quote in Chapter 1, where Enfield says that Hyde wasn't like a man. And in Chapter 4, and then twice more in Chapter 10, Stevenson refers to Hyde as being ape-like. This again has connotations of Hyde being like a lesser evolved creature than the stereotypical Victorian gentleman. We're supposed to get the impression that Hyde is less refined, less cultured, less advanced than the others around him. It infers that as an animal, Hyde is incapable of controlling these urges and emotions, and maybe this is one of the reasons he's so out of control in these violent attacks. Then again, with the animalistic behaviour, Hyde gnashes his teeth at the hansom driver, an act that is reminiscent of a dog baring its teeth and barking. It's like an uncivilised way of threatening someone. So this could be reflective of Hyde's animalistic nature, or maybe a sign of his absolute desperation at this point in the novel. Remember, he's trying to get off the streets as he's being hunted for the murder of Carew. Like a desperate animal, he's willing to do anything to avoid capture and to preserve his life at all costs, almost like the instinctive self-preservation of an animal. Now, of course, there are other references to Hyde as an animal throughout the novel, such as when Jekyll's servants are described as a flock of sheep in chapter 8, it's inferred that Hyde is the wolf. Next, we're going to look at how Stevenson presents Hyde as a violent character throughout the novel. To emphasise this behaviour, it may help to research and write about the role and the expected behaviour of the typical Victorian upper-class gentleman of the period. This will really highlight how different Hyde is, and why everyone takes such aversion to him, and why he seems to create such uproar in Victorian London. So we'll start off with the quote that's probably most remembered and used by students. Trampling has got connotations of violence and utter destruction, whilst it's juxtaposed by the adverb calmly. You can pick this oxymoron apart. Does calmly mean that he'd planned to do it, and that's why he's calm? Does it mean that he doesn't care? Does he have any conscience at all? There are lots of different interpretations that you can take from this quotation. Now, Hyde is described as a juggernaut twice in the novel, once in chapter 1, and then again with this quotation from chapter 2. Juggernauts in the modern day are lorries, just big trucks, or characters from the X-Men comics. Both are unstoppable, relentless forces once they get going. However, back in the Victorian era, when Britain colonised India, some people watched a Hindi ceremony in which a chariot is pulled through a city. And that chariot was called a juggernaut. Now, some eyewitnesses described seeing devotees to the religion throwing themselves in front of the chariot and being crushed to death. So the juggernaut in Hyde is supposed to represent the relentless, unstoppable, uncontrollable killing force that disregards the screams of children. And we could also read into the pagan religious connotations of this too. And from chapter 4, Hyde broke out of all bounds. Does this mean the bounds of self-restraint? The bounds of society's restrictive rules? Either way, like a caveman, he clubs Sir Danvers to the earth. He then proceeds to kill Sir Danvers. This is one of the most violent passages from the whole novel. Now, there are several parts to this quotation. We've got the ape-like, which we've already discussed, the trampling, which is a favourite verb of Hyde's, the storm of blows, like Hyde is an unstoppable force of nature, and the fact that the maid who is witnessing the event can actually hear the bones shatter gives you a sense of how ferocious the attack is. Great bit of imagery there, and perfect for a paragraph on violence. Fast forward to chapter 8, and we realise that Hyde commits suicide. 1. You have the taboo of suicide in a Christian society. It was seen as such a blasphemous crime that suicide victims were denied a Christian burial. They weren't allowed to be buried on church grounds. But 2, it's important to look at the word self-destroyer. Hyde was so violent that, in the end, he wasn't even safe from himself. He died by his own hand in the end. This could be interpreted as an act of cowardice because he didn't want to be held accountable for his crimes, or it could be seen as an act of bravery, depends on how you look at it. And then, from chapter 10, a quotation that students often overlook. He smote her in the face. And now a woman speaks to Hyde and offers him something, and he just smacks her in the face. In fact, it's more than that. Stevenson doesn't use the word smack, he doesn't say hit, he says smote, which specifically means to hit with a lot of force. We really get a sense of Hyde's anger or frustration here. Next, we've got an angle that I find particularly interesting, and that is thinking about Hyde as the victim of the story. Now, if you think about it, Hyde never asked to be created. He is all of the evil thoughts and intentions that Jekyll ever had distilled into one body. Now, Jekyll gets addicted to using him for horrible things, and this only causes Hyde to get stronger until he can be no longer controlled. We never even get to hear his side of things. For extra points on this, look into duality as a concept, or look at Sigmund Freud's personality theory, particularly his theory about the id. id. Now, we only hear Hyde speak a handful of times. These are mainly in chapters 1, 2, and 8. So starting off in chapter 1, when Enfield collars him after the trampling of the girl, one of the first things that Hyde says is that he's naturally helpless. And what does he mean here? That he'll have to pay them if they ask for compensation? Or is he saying that he cannot help himself, almost like he's addicted to these violent acts? Maybe he's got no conscience, and thus he's naturally helpless with a lack of self-control. In chapter 2, Utterson, who has never met Hyde before, takes it upon himself to stand outside the door waiting for Hyde. See this from Hyde's point of view for a minute. You've had a hard day trampling children, you just want to come home and put your feet up. But there's a strange man standing in the shadows outside your door, and this stalker says he wants a favour from you. Hyde has every right to be hostile towards Utterson, and yet, how does he reply? With perfect manners, with pleasure. What shall it be? If Hyde is supposed to be this deformed monster that everyone describes him as, would he really be this polite? Adding to this, when Hyde speaks to Lanyon in chapter 9, Lanyon describes Hyde as replying civilly. Next, we have the crying. Lots of crying. Poole says that Hyde had been crying all day. Maybe it's because of the pangs of addiction, or maybe it's cries of desperation. He doesn't want to be trapped as Hyde, who's a hunted man. The crying is also described as weeping like a woman or a lost soul. We realise that Hyde is really at a loss here, and he has no clue as what to do. And when Lanyon points out the potion ingredients in chapter 9 that he's been and got from the lab, Hyde gives a sob of immense relief. Again, this could be because the story can be interpreted as a drug addiction allegory. However, it could be said that Hyde isn't even comfortable in his own skin. He acts erratically, panicking that he will be stuck as Hyde forever. At this point, he actually wants to be able to turn into the Doctor. Granted, this is most likely because he will be hung for the murder of Carew. And finally, we have a quotation that doesn't necessarily paint Hyde as a victim, but more of a saviour or a hero. This is the point of the novel where Jekyll is sat on a park bench and he begins to turn into Hyde involuntarily. Jekyll admits that he probably would have given up at that point. However, Hyde rises to the occasion, formulates a plan, executes the plan, and gets Jekyll back in control. He seems determined to save the two of them at any cost. Again, linking back to what I said earlier, Hyde seems to have an innate desire to stay alive at all costs. It makes us see the human side of him. He's willing to do whatever it takes just to keep on living for a few more hours. Honestly, I think that a good argument can be made on this one. Are people just acting with prejudice towards Hyde when they describe him as the devil incarnate? Is he really as bad as everyone makes him out? Yes, he kills Sir Danvers, but Jekyll has taken away Hyde's off switch. I don't think that Hyde could stop even if he wanted to. And the quotation from chapter 2, the murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, suggests that maybe he does want to stop. Timidity is essentially shyness, after all. Now, on the complete flip side to the last slide, we're going to look at quotations that indicate Hyde is actually evil. Now, there are plenty of quotations with religious connotations and biblical references, so it's a good idea to read up on Christianity and its importance in the Victorian era. And while you're at it, research Gothic literature. The genre is full of evil monsters, so it's interesting to see how Hyde fits into that category. First off, we have the black and sneering monster in chapter 1. There are plenty of connotations that you can take from those two words alone, but then Enfield throws in the word Satan. You could have a field day with the inferences in just that quotation. During Utterson's nightmare in chapter 2, he describes a figure by the side of Jekyll's bed that seems to control Jekyll and make Jekyll do whatever it wants. Describing Hyde in this way is reminiscent of that sort of vampire mind control that vampires have in old vampire movies. Now, whilst Dracula hadn't actually been published when Stevenson was writing Jekyll and Hyde, vampires and their psychic powers had existed in folklore for centuries. So perhaps Stevenson was drawing on these tales to create an evil picture of Hyde. Now, after meeting Hyde for the first time, Utterson notes that Hyde has Satan's signature on his face. This is essentially saying that Hyde is the devil incarnate. Satan has already signed Hyde to his team, and Hyde is now destined for a life of evil, cruelty and brutality. Again, check out the Victorians' attitudes towards Christianity in order to get a sense of how big of a deal it was to call someone the devil, especially in high society. A great flame of anger also has connotations of hell, Satan and damnation. As most Victorians saw themselves as Christians, this automatically paints Hyde as the outsider. Look into the connotations of the individual words here to maximise your mark. Great could relate to power. Flame could relate to violence or a lack of control, or hell. Anger could also connote violence or a lack of self-control. Either way, overall, this quotation is a good one for showing Hyde as evil or violent. In this quotation from chapter 6, Hyde is directly referred to as an evil influence in the life of Jekyll. As soon as Hyde disappears after the murder of Carew, Jekyll begins seeing his friends more, starts donating to charity, going to church. It's almost as if Hyde was this dark cloud in the life of Jekyll. And another great quotation here. Jekyll says that his devil had long been caged and came out roaring. Now, one interpretation could be that his devil is Edward Hyde, and after keeping Hyde locked up inside him for so long, Hyde eventually broke free and was uncontrollable in his evil acts. You can look at the connotations of devil, cage, and roaring here. However, you could interpret this quotation in different ways. Have a think about what else Jekyll's caged devil could be. Personally, I think one of Stevenson's main points is that we don't need to be scared of made-up monsters from books such as Dracula, Frankenstein, or The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, these other Gothic classics. Why be scared of them, those made-up monsters, when normal people, such as Jekyll, can do terrible things too? And Jekyll could be your nice, respectable next-door neighbour. Everyone has got their own Mr Hyde, and that's the thing that we should be scared of. That, for me, is one of the key messages from Stevenson in this novel. And finally, a fifth way of interpreting Edward Hyde is to see Hyde as a type of extended metaphor. If we keep in mind that everyone, Utterson, Enfield, Lanyon, the Sawbones, everyone who meets Hyde takes an extreme dislike to him, we could then say that maybe Hyde is supposed to represent something else. Mr Hyde could be a metaphor for a whole group of people that were not seen as worthy of respect by Victorian society. For this one, it would be a good idea to research the attitudes of the Victorian upper class society and any prejudices that they may have held. So first off, we have the area where Mr Hyde lives, a dismal quarter of Soho. This, at the time, was a poorer area of London, an area where many of the working class would have worked and lived. So perhaps Mr Hyde could be a metaphor for all of the working classes, and that's why none of the upper class characters can seem to stand the sight of him. Or perhaps with his deformity and his stumping walk, Hyde is a metaphor for the physically disabled, people that the Victorians would have looked down upon. Or maybe it's the mentally disabled, as in chapter 4 he's labelled as being like a madman. Or with quotations like these, Hyde could represent the people that the Victorian elite considered to be less sophisticated than themselves. There are plenty of other marginalised groups that Hyde could represent. We only have to look at the fact that none of the upper class characters can put their fingers on why they hate him so much. Now, this could be due to some deep-seated, almost innate prejudices that these characters hold towards some groups in society. Perhaps this is Stevenson's way of exposing the ridiculous attitudes of the Victorian society in real life through the characters of his book. Or, rather than a group of people, perhaps Hyde could represent an idea. The repetition of the ape-like simile seems to be a clear nod towards Darwin. So maybe Hyde could represent the scientific advancement of the period, and the dislike shown towards Hyde could represent the fear of scientific advancement held by many Victorians. So there we have 5 ways that Hyde is presented. And as I said at the beginning, there are many more ways that you can interpret the character, and there are many more quotations that are worth noting down about Hyde, but it's definitely useful to make yourself a set of revision cards for Hyde's key quotes. Make your own ones instead of buying a set too. Not only are they cheaper, but you're much more likely to remember what's on them when you've written them yourself. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, a chance to show off everything that you've learned. This one is an extract from chapter 10, so read the extract and then complete the question on the left. Starting with this extract, how does Stevenson present Mr Hyde? You can write about how Stevenson presents Mr Hyde in this extract, and how Stevenson presents Mr Hyde in the novel as a whole. For the first bullet point, only use quotations from this extract. For the second bullet point, you can use quotations from anywhere else in the novel, or from anywhere in this video. Use the timings that your teacher has given you, but I always say to my students, 1 paragraph on bullet point 1, 1 paragraph on bullet point 2, and then, if you've got time left, a third paragraph on a bullet point of your choosing. 45 minutes total, including time to plan your answer and to read through it and edit at the end. And it's perfectly fine to have different approaches to the question. For example, you might say that this extract shows Hyde as violent for bullet point 1, but your second paragraph might show that he's presented as the true victim of the novel, and that's fine, it's up to you. Assessment Objective 1 is all about your opinions on the character, so if you're answering this question, pause the video now and off you go. Good luck. And that's all for today's video. I do hope you found it useful. If there are any topics that you want me to make a video on, leave a comment below and I'll get on it. Thanks for watching and happy revising.